Coming up.
TETRA was an incredible success, and I think one of the problems that we've had trying to reproduce that success within the 3GPP world and the MCX world, we're starting to see real progress now, potential turning points in the migration. There is no one mission-critical technology that can satisfy the needs of all users. 3GPP MCX technology will not necessarily be lower cost than TETRA. What's important is that you need to reduce the costs of existing networks. The days of one single supplier trying to provide the whole network to an end user, I think, is well and truly over. But what's interesting about Saudi Arabia at the moment is that there are actually two large MCX projects that are rolling out simultaneously. Users really don't care that much about the technology. So it's so important to listen to users.
Welcome to Making Waves, the podcast where we explore the technology, people, and real-world challenges shaping the world of critical communications. From PMR radio to next-gen broadband, we talk with industry experts and frontline users to uncover the pain points, innovations, and decisions that define performance under pressure. If it keeps teams connected when it matters most, we'll be talking about it here. I'm Stuart with co-host Hauke.
Hi, everybody.
And Lona.
Hello.
So, Lona, what do we have today?
Today we are joined by Peter Clemons, one of the most respected and influential voices in the global critical communications community. With over 30 years in the industry, Peter has been at the forefront of the move from traditional LMR systems to broadband and mission-critical services. As the founder of Quixoticity and an advocate for MCX adoption, he now works closely with Interoperability technologies, helping shape how broadband networks additionally support the world's most vital communications. Peter, welcome to the podcast.
You actually made me slightly older than I actually am. You said over 30 years, so it's 30 years in the industry next year, but that's perfectly fine. Yeah, I'm very happy to be here, as I say, and hopefully I'll be able to give some insights from those 30 years of experience and also look forward to what's coming next.
So let's dive in, because you have really been part of the incredible TETRA success story. You wrote your first TETRA report back in 1996, even before any networks had been deployed. You also helped Teltronic build a strong position in the Latin American market and represented the company within the TCCA. Before we jump into the questions, could you just tell us a bit more about yourself and your role today?
So it's quite interesting how I even got into PMR, because my first degree was actually Hispanic and Latin American studies. And I actually spent a number of years in Latin America studying economics. And then I came back to the University of Bristol again to do a degree in economics and finance. And as part of that, I actually wrote a thesis that was connected to access pricing in BT. So it was just when the telecoms industry was starting to open up and the whole privatization and competition issues. And so I was looking for a position in telecoms, and we relocated to London towards the end of 1996. And the first report that I ever wrote was about this new technology that I knew nothing about, and that was TETRA. It's quite interesting, actually. I was talking to people. I was confusing radio and professional mobile radio in some of those early interviews. I think Russian broadcasters were telling me how many radio users they had. I had to remove the professional mobile radio part of that.
Peter, you've seen the industry evolve from analog to digital technologies like TETRA, P25, DMR, and now some users are looking at MCX. Could you explore a little bit on where we are there and what is the current gap to existing technologies like TETRA when we compare it to the current standard, that the 3GPP standards? Where are we with that at the moment?
Okay, it's quite a lot to unpack there, Hulk, I think. So if we kind of go from MPT 1327 to 6G in a single question. TETRA was an incredible success, and I think one of the problems that we've had trying to reproduce that success within the 3GPP world and the MCX world was just trying to reproduce that moment during the 1990s and the early 2000s, and when we succeeded in bringing together a lot of bespoke proprietary technologies. Often each country within Europe had perhaps a national champion or had their own particular particular national technology, etc. So the development within ETSI of not just, obviously when we know the great success of GSM globally led to the complete transformation of all of our lives within the cellular world. But it was also, I think, very, very clever of ETSI and very interesting that they decided also to develop a sister standard to GSM, which was the TETRA standard, which began as the Trans-European Trunked Radio standard. And then as it became more and more successful around the world, just simply became the terrestrial Trunked Radio standard. So TETRA, initially also there were two streams to TETRA. So there was the public safety and the professional stream, and there was also this more commercial standard, an alternative perhaps to the mobile operators. And we saw this model with Dolphin during the 1990s that ended up not being a success, I think mainly because of the overlap with GSM. But TETRA did become a success, I think, initially through the public safety. So public safety has very much been at the forefront of a lot of the developments within professional mobile radio. But the success of TETRA within fairly large nationwide public safety networks allowed us to reach the economies of scale where particularly the TETRA SME suppliers were able to satisfy the needs of a wide range of professional users, utilities, industries, etc., etc. So that's beginning with the success of TETRA on the professional side. And then around the early 2010s, I was on the board of the TETRA Association that we changed the name to TCCA, TETRA and Critical Communications Association, now just the Critical Communications Association. It was very clear, particularly I think from a lot of the user groups and some of the national governments within the TCCA, and that there was a need to start looking at new applications, new opportunities as we were moving towards a mobile broadband world. And so we set up the Critical Communications Broadband Group, which was led initially by Tony Gray and has been led for some time now by Tero Personen. And we engaged with 3GPP because we were coming out of a financial crisis towards the end of the 2000s. So the possibility of governments developing a TETRA 3 technology was becoming a more and more distant possibility. The early days within 3GPP were a big challenge for us because we were moving from a TETRA world, a P25 world, where we were very much in control of the development of the technology, the development of the services, etc., towards a much larger world. So we always mention that there are 7 billion people in the world and a lot more machines, and they all have subscriptions, or a majority have a subscription to a mobile operator. But we're really looking at only tens of millions of users in the PMR space. So at the very early days of 3GPP, it was quite difficult for us to make progress. But I think within 3GPP, within ETSI, etc., there was an understanding that maybe this was an opportunity, a possibility to open up the 3GPP community to what they like to call the verticals. It began with public safety, with the creation of a new working group within 3GPP, the SA6 group, which was initially public safety, but has now been extended to other verticals and also to the application layer within 3GPP rather than just the concentration on the lower layers. So we've moved forward through a number of releases. It's coming up to 10 years since the first release of the Mission Critical Push to Talk and then the Mission Critical Push to Everything, or MCX technology. And we're starting to see real progress now, potential turning points in the migration from TETRA to 3GPP technology. But as I've always said in the past, and continue to say in the present, and will no doubt also say in the future, there is no one mission-critical technology that can satisfy the needs of all users. So not even TETRA. TETRA has always needed the support of other protocols, satellite services that were fairly basic, perhaps. Narrowband voice. We're now looking at the potential for more advanced services over satellite. And TETRA has served us very, very well in the case of mission critical voice.
Let me pick you up on that then, Peter. You talk about going from the early days, the requirements, and often public safety are the first adopters of any technologies. And when it gets to a critical mass, it gets cheaper because it's an open standard and other users get to use it as well. But what are you seeing in terms of adoption? How are public safety in particular, because they're the ones with the bigger budgets, how are they balancing the transition between what they have today, the tried and tested, robust TETRA or P25 or whatever they have as their current technologies, their dependable technologies, and the move towards MCX? How are they balancing that investment?
What we're not seeing one single model. And I think eventually, I think that's very positive for our industry. We've seen different countries, different agencies choosing different models during their migration process. Now, there are a number of pioneer countries, we might say. So FirstNet, the first responder network authority, was created in 2012 in United States. To drive the move towards next generation public safety services. What FirstNet decided was, first they partnered with one of the large MNOs, AT&T, and they gave AT&T some prime spectrum in 700 megahertz to build a nationwide public safety broadband network. At the same time, they did not mandate any of their agencies necessarily, did not necessarily need to take up FirstNet. They still had the choice. There was no immediate need or requirement to move from, for example, existing P25 or kind of similar narrowband protocols towards the new broadband service. So to begin with, the focus was very much on allowing building the network, allowing data to flow over that network, building these services, participating actively within 3GPP and the global community. We have the case of the SafeNet Forum within Korea. So the SafeNet was set up after 2014. There was a ferry disaster where several hundred people lost their lives, including school children. And one of the main reasons for this in the inquiry was the lack of clear communications between the different authorities. There was no single narrowband nationwide network in Korea, and they were quite advanced within the 4G world. They had Samsung as a major supplier of mobile broadband equipment. They had some of the leading MNOs in the world. So the Korean government actively started participating in 3GPP, and they also built a dedicated LTE network and started migrating kind of users towards that. The UK is a case that I know well, ESN, so the Emergency Services Network. The Home Office made a decision very early on that it was their intention to switch off the TETRA network at some point and switch to 3GPP technology. Reality has hit, and the original deadlines within the 2015, 2016 were pushed back to 2019. They were pushed back to the mid-2020s, and we are now looking at migration around the 2029 to 2031, 2032 timeframe. And if we start to look at some of the followers across Europe, and in other parts as well, the date towards the end of this decade or early in the next decade is being considered for switching off the TETRA networks. This is also not unanimous because there are probably also an equal number of countries and that would probably continue to use their TETRA networks well into the 2030s. I was always accused within 3GPP of defending TETRA, and within the TETRA community, I was always criticized for pushing the 3GPP. But what I've always said is it's not one particular technology, one particular solution that is mission critical. Each agency, each country will look at its particular circumstances. I definitely advocate, if you are going to continue with TETRA technology, you need to reduce the cost of operating that existing TETRA network.
In comparison to what piece? What are you comparing that cost reduction to?
Okay, so let's say that some of the early TETRA networks, before we'd reached economies of scale, before the technology had matured, had an elevated cost, let's say, particularly for certain, the way that they were procured, the way that they were designed, the way that they were delivered. TETRA is a global standard, but not all of the original interfaces that we designed during the 1990s have necessarily been implemented. So particularly in the case of the large nationwide networks, the interpretation of the standard allowed certain interfaces, certain parts of the network for it to be very difficult to mix and match different suppliers, which gave a very strong advantage to certain TETRA suppliers. Whether intentional or not, the fact that they had an advantage. What we're seeing as TETRA has matured, we've seen the technology also progress, a large number of suppliers that would be able to provide alternatives to this. So in a way, as you require 3GPP MCX technology will not necessarily be cheaper, will not necessarily be lower cost than TETRA. But what's important is that you need to reduce the costs of existing networks. And one of the ways of reducing that cost is to make sure it is as open as possible. And what is interesting is that some countries that made certain decisions 10 years ago and to go down a very expensive direct migration route, it may have been possible at that time to look at other ways of deploying true standards-based, more open TETRA networks that would have freed up funds to dedicate to 3GPP technologies, but also complementary technologies and services. So it really comes down, it's that balance of there's only a finite amount of resources that can be dedicated to public safety communications, and we need to make sure that these systems are based on open standards, open protocols. That also allows us to incorporate any new trends, any new services and applications that may come in the future.
I think we probably need to mention for our listeners that you are referring to the base stations in TETRA not having a standardized interface, where the interface where we talk about radio users, this is a standardized interface, and that is also the reason why we have this great interoperability in TETRA today. And for the base stations, this is not existing, as at the beginning of the standard, there was just no budget for defining such an interface. That was the main reason at the beginning for it. But how can we now manage to get this standardized interface implemented? So, I mean, how can we do that?
Okay, that's difficult. And I think in a way we're almost kind of moving backwards, I guess, on the TETRA case now. As I say, there was perhaps an opportunity a number of years ago kind of to move towards that. It may still be a possibility. And as you say, I mean, the TETRA interoperability profile between the base station and the terminals themselves, that process has been a very, very successful process that allowed a wide range of user terminals to be deployed within the network. There were some kind of limitations. It's actually quite interesting when we look at some of the work within interoperability that has been carried out within 3GPP and ETSI regarding the interworking function, where the possibility to interconnect at a basic level, but a functional level, existing TETRA networks and 3GPP kind of MCX networks, it would possibly be possible to kind of continue with the work that's been done in the interworking function that allows MCX systems to be opened, TETRA systems to be opened. That might be an interesting kind of avenue. But from my work, trying to integration that is required, and the fact that we have an ever-growing ecosystem of companies, traditional TETRA vendors, 3GPP vendors, applications providers, service providers. The most important thing we can do is make sure that the solutions are as open as possible, guaranteeing high levels of security so that we can benefit from the competition and the innovation brought from the wide range of suppliers within the ecosystem. The days of one single supplier trying to provide the whole network to an end user, I think, is well and truly over.
And let me pick you up on that point, because you talk about the growing ecosystem here. It was mentioned earlier that you work with Enensys. Enensys has a role, obviously, in MCX. They're more known for broadcast and transportation systems. So where do they fit? What is their contribution into this space?
Okay, Enensys have an interesting role, let's say. So the background to Enensys is very much in broadcasting and media. Enensys actually acquired another French company called EXPOE, that was heavily involved in the early 3GPP MCX standards. So basically, our industry arrived a little bit late to the LTE standardization. So a lot of the lower layers, the lower technological layers had already been defined. And 3GPP technologies are inherently what we call unicast technology. So you are one person is calling another. Of course, you've got WhatsApp and everything else where you create groups. But basically, the LTE technology, 3GPP technologies, are opening a channel between two users. So the Enensys technology from the MCPTT, the MCX, the first releases of MCX, it was decided that a multicast solution was also required to go on top of the unicast, the one-to-one. The public safety, the professional mobile radio community required a one-to-many to give confidence to police officers, to emergency services, that when they press that button and they need to reach instantaneously 20, 50, 100 colleagues attending a particular event, a particular incident. So the eMBMS technology originally, the main use case for this was considered to be a football stadium or some concert where you would have thousands of kind of young people who wanted to kind of share selfies and wanted to kind of stream. And that use case, for whatever reason, never really took off. I think the main reason was that mobile operators had to dedicate a certain amount of their spectrum resources, their frequencies to this service. They couldn't really find a business case for this. So ironically, when we were defining the MCX standards, we took the eMBMS and actually defined that for a completely different use case and a different group, which was public safety, emergency services. What has happened is that the eMBMS, the multicast technology, has continued to evolve. And what we actually have now is we have the possibility to dynamically assign frequencies between unicast and multicast. So we can actually improve the spectral efficiency of deploying a solution such as multicast. And Enensys, we do not kind of manufacture any particular products. We very much focus on the software and the middleware, both in the network and also in the devices, that enables the MCX application to be delivered during these use cases where you need a large number of users. So we really depend, again, as you say, we depend on the full ecosystem opening up, respecting the protocols, the interfaces that are standardized within 3GPP in order to deliver this service.
Would you expect also that the big mobile carriers implement these functionalities in their networks? Do you know how they see that feature? Are they open to implement that? Or
what is interesting here is that this is not a PowerPoint slide. These are not 3GPP specification document. Actually, we have actually implemented our solution within public safety networks. What we're seeing at the moment is that when the public safety agency has its own dedicated spectrum, but perhaps a limited amount of dedicated spectrum, so 3 megahertz, 5 megahertz, in FDD, they realize that they need this eMBMS technology in order to deploy that. I think when we look at MNOs, really what they've always tried to do is optimize every single kilohertz, the spectrum that they have. And I think that they thought that there's kind of some limitation with that. So the early use cases we're seeing is where the public safety agencies have their own dedicated frequencies. They may then use the MNOs for day-to-day operations. But when there is a major emergency and they want to guarantee that everybody on the group call will receive that communication at exactly the same time, that is when we're seeing a growing number of European public safety operators, but also other users around the world, and starting to mandate kind of eMBMS for their MCX deployment. And this is eMBMS is one of the features required, I think, to allow that migration from TETRA to 3GPP technologies, together with the device-to-device, so the DMO in TETRA, the side link in 3GPP Talk, which is an amplified DMO, including relays as well, and the interworking function that I mentioned earlier, together with the special kind of devices that are required, accessories, and a wide range of integration with other technologies that maybe MNOs have not necessarily required. So eMBMS is one of those points in order to allow us to migrate. There will be a long period, I think, of integration of a number of different technologies. So as I say, standards, open standards, taking advantage of the full ecosystem. And also what we're seeing now is we're seeing increasingly specialized systems integrators that are starting to step up and assist the public safety agencies and some of the traditional critical communications operators to bring together all of these different elements. It's a very, very complex situation, and I think that's why it's taken a long, long time for us to kind of reach this stage now where the future is becoming a little bit clearer.
One of the things I love about you, Peter, is we ask you a question and you rattle through the next 5 or 6 questions that we actually have for you written down.
What regions or projects do you see leading the way in making MCX a practical reality?
I mentioned FirstNet, so FirstNet was very, very important. I think FirstNet and SafeNet, so the FirstNet in the US, SafeNet in Korea, really kind of pushed standards along. And we were lucky that within Europe as well, there were a large number of agencies that were already members of TCCA that also kind of stepped up to the 3GPP plate. But a region that I haven't mentioned yet and that I keep a very, very close eye on is the Middle East. So it's very interesting to see the Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and the other countries within the GCC. They're very ambitious and they really like to kind of push the envelope and kind of push the limits of what's possible. Back in 2016, I went to Saudi Arabia to work for a company called Bravo, that is now part of STC Specialized. I actually went to build a public safety LTE network back in 2016. And we actually ended up building a TETRA network first. And they're now in the process of rolling out a public safety LTE network, finally. But what's interesting about Saudi Arabia at the moment is that there are actually 2 large MCX projects that are rolling out simultaneously. And I think this will be very interesting to see how this works and what the implications are for MCX going forward. So we have STC, the Specialized, that will roll out a government and public safety nationwide network in 800 megahertz across Saudi Arabia. And we have Aramco, one of the world's largest companies, oil company, that's actually been awarded by the Saudi regulator a license in 450 megahertz to roll out a nationwide network, not just for itself, but also for any other industry, oil and gas, utility, etc., that may use it. What's interesting about Aramco is that it has reached an agreement with Qualcomm regarding the move to 5G. So within 3GPP, we've been looking at how we can translate the kind of existing public safety LTE MCX standards into 5G and beyond. What's interesting about Aramco is that it is large enough and powerful enough to talk to the Qualcomms of this world about actually developing fundamental technology at the chipset level to enable all the necessary features within the existing MCX, within the 5G framework as well. I mean, regarding NNSys, this is particularly interesting as well because the multicast technology within 5G will require a support at the chipset layer, and there will also be, because there will be some improvements to this as well. So Middle East is interesting. I think public safety, Europe is kind of driving, particularly when we look at the EU CCS, the European Critical Communications System initiative at the European Commission, the European Union level as well. That's very, very kind of important initiative. But what we will see is each individual nation will develop its own nationwide system. But the EU CCS is working at that kind of interoperability layer above that. So getting the different MCX suppliers to work together to interoperate with each other. And EU CCS will also go beyond the simple technology. So you actually go into a lot of the operational procedures, you go into a lot of the procedures that you cannot write down within standards. No, they're behind the standards. These are the ways that we work, the ways that we move forward.
What is it that is required now to speed up the whole process? I mean, the standard is there for a long time, and we are waiting for those first deployments really to happen. But how can that be accelerated?
We all need to work together. And so you have the technology, you have the process, but it's often the people that are the hardest part, as we all know. And also, there are different generations, there are different cultures, different mentalities. I think it goes far beyond a standard. What a standard can do is make sure that a particular technology works, that there are certain services, that there are basic features. But on top of that, everybody needs to work together. Everybody has their own requirements, their own preferences. And so the standards are a necessary first stage, but really societies and economies that are built on that. I'm actually optimistic about the future. The journey has been an important and a necessary one.
I think we all agree standards are a key success factor. It was the reason why TETRA is successful, or has been successful, and it still is. And this is the same for MCX. But do you think, is there any misconceptions people have about mission-critical broadband?
We're probably not the best people to talk to about that. Users really don't care that much about the technology. So it's so important to listen to users, to listen to the people who are actually going to kind of use that technology. Sometimes we get tied up in 3GPP meetings and a lot of technology talk and, it's taking so long, etc., etc. And perhaps some of the earlier failures in MCX were just simply not kind of listening to the users and thinking and trying to perhaps impose something. And this like arrogance that kind of we know best, and thinking that bringing out a lot of press releases and kind of using a lot of acronyms and talking a lot about the technology might actually solve everything. In general, although obviously I read a lot of technology documents and go into the technology in some detail, I always try to explain MCX in simple terms. I try to use the kind of language that, like at a CXO level or a user level, etc., that people understand. And I think if you cannot explain something in simple terms, there will probably be a problem implementing that technology.
Okay, Peter, one last question. Based on your long experience and now with Quixoticity, what is your focus for coming months ahead of celebrating 30 years in critical communications industry at CCW 2026 next June in London?
You may be interested to know that I'm working on a secret project. That's probably not so secret if you go onto my LinkedIn. Back in 2017, 2018, I published the Quixoticity Index, where I took a look at about 10 different countries around the world and tried to benchmark them according to kind of a number of criteria, not just the technology as well. So a number of others, so even societal, geopolitical, and sustainable development goals as well. So how green some of these solutions were. Then for a number of reasons, we had Brexit, we had COVID, we had a number of other things as well. And I thought it was time to relaunch the index, particularly as CCW 2026 in London will be my 30 years. What I'm looking at is actually focusing primarily on Europe. So there will be a strong doses of EU CCS. Quixoticity has recently joined PSC Europe. I've also joined BAPCO, British APCO. So I'll be taking a look at the European experience, how MCX has evolved in Europe, what the current status is, where I think it's likely to go over the next 5 to 10 years, benchmarking a number of countries, traveling around. I've seen interest also in the Middle East, Asia Pacific, Latin America for this type of subject. So it'll be interesting to see, kind of take a region such as Europe, study that very, very carefully, reach some insights, reach some conclusions, advice for kind of the European players as well, but also then take that to kind of other parts of the world and kind of see kind of how relevant that is, how that is different. The main focus for the moment will be to try to keep it as straightforward as possible, focus on the kind of the main issues, but definitely deliver the next iteration of the index at Critical Communications World 2026.
That sounds like something that a lot of people might be interested going forward. We always run out of time, and we had so many more questions for you. Maybe we'll get you back on another episode in the future. Okay, so let me try and touch at least on some of the things that we've talked about here. We've had a reflection of your 30 years in the industry. We've looked into the MCS progress going right the way back to the early days of implementation of broadband networks, and you've given us a nice little potted history from around the world. That was quite useful for the referencing, I guess, for the listeners to pick up on. You've talked a little bit about the shared mission in terms of an eventual migration, but the better together kind of approach of what we have today in terms of narrowband and what we will go to in the future, and essentially the next generation of what's going to carry on for, in global critical communications. I'm sure I've left out a lot of things, but that's just I'm just going to encourage the listeners to go back and listen to it again. I will just say at this point a big thank you to Peter Clemons, our guest this week, and to my co-host Hauke.
Thank you.
And Lona.
Thank you and goodbye.
And if you found that interesting, I'm going to suggest that you subscribe to our podcast. We're available on all of the major podcast platforms. And by virtue of recording this in video, you'll find us on YouTube as well. Just type in Making Waves Podcast. You should find us through a Google search, or you could find us more conveniently on our website, damcellularsystems.com/podcasts, where you'll find all of the links. So that's it for this week. I've been Stuart, and that was Making Waves. So until next time, goodbye.